Hey folks, we're going to talk about SOH-CAH-TOA today. Back to easing our way into the semester with trig, and we'll start with just the fact that they express a ratio of two sides of a right triangle. So in other words, it's a fraction. That's what they are. Here's what they are. Specifically, sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. And notice how that's captured here. Sine opposite over hypotenuse, cosine adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent opposite over adjacent. So that little SOH-CAH-TOA is just a way to remember that the fact that these are fractions or that these are ratios of two sides. And as you can see, there's a labeled triangle. Go and get that down. I've labeled all the sides. And we're going to use SOH-CAH-TOA to then answer this question. We can see our reference angle is right here. So we're talking about this angle. We want to find sine. Sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. And so what's the opposite of this angle? It's this. What's the hypotenuse? It's that. And so it's just 5 over 13. Continuing on, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. What's the adjacent of this angle? In other words, what's the side that's next to it that's not the hypotenuse? It's this one over the hypotenuse. So it's 12 over 13. And then finally, tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. So 5 over 12. So that's as simple as it is. It really is super straightforward. There's one thing you need to keep in mind, and that's the opposite and adjacent sides depend on the reference angle. Hypotenuse is obviously never going to change because it's always the longest side, right? But if I were talking about this angle here, all of a sudden the opposite side becomes this, and the adjacent side becomes this, right? Because we're talking about a different angle, so it's a different ratio, a different relationship. Continuing on, you can see that I've set it up that way. So we're going to talk about this in relationship to sine of theta, cosine of theta, and tangent of theta. And then after that, we're going to go to this angle and look at the relationship using that angle instead. All right, so let's go into that super fast. So we know that sine is opposite over the hypotenuse. So what is the opposite of this angle? It's 10, right? Opposite of the angle is 10. And what's the hypotenuse? It's 26. And we should simplify, but we'll keep going. All right, we'll keep going. What is cosine? Well, cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. What is the adjacent of this angle? Adjacent of this angle is 24. It's the one that's next to it that's not the hypotenuse. So this is going to be 24 over 26. And then tangent is going to be the opposite over the adjacent. Remember, all that comes from this little way to remember it. And what's the opposite? Again, the opposite is this one. The adjacent is that one. And so it's going to be 10 over 24. So that's for theta. We just figured out. What about for beta? Well, again, sine is still opposite over the hypotenuse. Cosine is still the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And tangent still means opposite over adjacent. Right, that hasn't changed. Those are all the same. But the reference is different now. So what is the opposite of beta? The opposite side of beta is 24. That's the adjacent side. The adjacent side is 10. And of course, the hypotenuse is still 26. So maybe we can label it, just make it a little bit clearer. Opposite side, adjacent, and the hypotenuse. So what's sine going to be? Well, it's going to be the opposite, which is 24 over 26. Cosine is going to be adjacent, 10 over 26. And then opposite over adjacent is now going to be 24 over 10. So there you go. Simple as that. All right, you can see that I left you the notes at the top. I'll just remind you what they are. And you just have these two problems, problem 1, problem 2, and you want to find sine cosine tangent of theta and of beta, beta and of beta for both of these triangles. Right? So just like what we did in this page, that is all you are doing for this one, right? So sine of theta is the opposite over the hypotenuse. Here's theta, there's the opposite. So that would be 3 over 5. And then just keep going with it. So get those copied, work those out. Easy peasy. All right, folks.